What if every thought in your head, every decision, every belief, every reaction was actually programmed into you by someone else? The science shows this might be more true than any of us want to admit.
That's quite the unsettling thought to open with, but there's fascinating research backing this up.
Let me share something that absolutely floored me. Studies show that about 95% of our thoughts today are exactly the same ones we had yesterday. We're basically running on mental autopilot.
Hold on, you're telling me only 5% of what we think each day is actually new?
Exactly. And here's where it gets wild. Our brains aren't even designed to seek truth. They're optimized for efficiency, like biological computers always looking for shortcuts.
That makes so much sense when you consider how neural pathways develop. It's like water creating grooves in a hillside. Once those patterns form, thoughts just naturally follow those same paths.
And those pathways, they start forming from the moment we're born, shaped by every experience, every word we hear, every interaction. We're being programmed without realizing it.
You know what's fascinating about that? The research shows these pathways are especially susceptible to programming during childhood. Those early messages become deeply embedded in our neural architecture.
Let me share a personal example. Growing up, I constantly heard nothing comes easy in life, and you have to work harder than everyone else. Now, decades later, I catch myself pushing to burnout because those messages are so deeply wired in.
That's such a perfect illustration of how early programming affects adult behaviour. And what's really concerning is this programming isn't random. There are powerful forces actively working to shape our thinking.
Right. We're talking about systematic manipulation by media, corporations, and institutions. They understand something crucial about human psychology that most people don't realize.
That we make decisions emotionally first, then justify them logically afterward.
Exactly. And these organizations use sophisticated techniques like social conditioning and repetition to essentially hack our mental programming. Think about how schools often reward memorization and compliance over critical thinking.
And in today's digital age, with social media algorithms and targeted content, this programming happens at an unprecedented scale.
Here's where quantum mechanics takes this to another level. The famous double-slit experiment showed that particles actually behave differently when they're being observed. This suggests consciousness itself influences physical reality.
So if our thoughts aren't truly our own, whose reality are we actually creating?
That's the million-dollar question. We might be manifesting a reality based on programming we never consciously chose. But here's the good news. We can actually rewire these mental patterns once we become aware of them.
Through neuroplasticity, right? The brain's ability to form new neural connections throughout life.
Exactly. The first step is developing awareness, questioning where our thoughts and beliefs actually come from. Why do we feel guilty about taking time off? Why do we assume certain things are impossible for us?
That level of self-examination can be pretty uncomfortable though.
True, but that discomfort is actually a good sign. It means you're pushing against those established neural pathways, creating potential for new ones. It's like exercising a muscle you've never used before.
So how do we work with that resistance instead of letting it stop us?
I use what I call the curiosity method. Instead of forcing yourself to think differently, get curious about your current thoughts. Why do I believe this? Where did this idea come from? What evidence do I actually have?
That's such a gentle way to approach it. Instead of fighting the programming, you're simply observing and questioning it.
And here's where quantum mechanics comes back into play. By observing our thoughts this way, we're actually changing them. Just like those particles in the experiment, the act of conscious observation changes the behavior.
That's fascinating. So our awareness itself becomes a tool for change?
Exactly. But it's important to note, this isn't about eliminating all influence from our minds. It's about becoming conscious of these influences so we can choose which ones we want to keep.
That's such an important distinction. We're not trying to become completely independent of all programming. We're trying to become active participants in our own programming.
Right. And that brings us to what I think is the most crucial point, the importance of intentionally choosing what we expose ourselves to. Every piece of media we consume, every conversation we have, is either reinforcing old programming or creating new patterns.
So, in essence, we're always being programmed. The question is whether we're active participants or passive recipients.
That's exactly it. And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity we're facing in this age of information overload. We have more potential than ever to shape our own minds, but we also face more sophisticated attempts to program us than ever before.
What a powerful way to look at it. And what an important reminder to be mindful about what we're allowing to influence our thoughts.
You know what I hope people take away from this conversation? The understanding that while our thoughts might not be entirely our own right now, we have the power to start taking control of our mental programming.
That's such a hopeful message to end on. It's not about feeling powerless over our programming. It's about recognizing our power to reshape it.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, the most important question isn't are my thoughts my own, but rather what am I going to do now that I know they might not be?